Alberta Primetime with Michael Higgins.
Welcome to Alberta Primetime. Ahead tonight, our politics panel on First Nations fighting to stop a referendum on separation. But first, the Big Tent Liberal Party.
10 years, 4 elections of experience in Parliament, and one of the most collaborative members of Parliament working across party lines on important issues.
The Prime Minister introducing longtime Conservative Marilyn Gladu, the latest MP to cross the floor to the Liberals, putting the government 1 seat shy of a majority, and it comes ahead of the party's annual convention and next week's by-elections. And joining us now, Sabrina Grover, a Liberal strategist and former candidate in Calgary Centre. Sabrina, good to see you. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me from Montreal.
From Montreal, yes. You are in Montreal for the Liberals' annual convention. Now let's maybe start on Marilyn Gladu crossing the floor. A lot of surprised political watchers given the social conservative values she's reflected in the past. To what degree do you see this moving Liberal values further to the right?
I don't think that it's going to affect Liberal values, but I do think that it is an important thing that caucus and the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister himself are going to have to manage. And I don't think that it's going to be a values conversation. I mean, you know, it is a big tent. We do have a number of different kinds of folks in this Liberal party. I think this is stretching that tent a little bit. And I think that is an important consideration. But I think more importantly, it's going to be, how does Marilyn fit into caucus? How does that dynamic play out? I think we've already seen a lot of interesting caucus management issues over the last couple of years, including, famously Stephen Guilbeault leaving cabinet earlier this year. So I think that that's going to be the question, but I don't really think it changes the nature of who the party is, what the values are, and what we're going to talk about this weekend when we gather on the convention floor.
Well, now, how important was it to have this happen before your party's convention this weekend?
I think it was important to happen not just before the convention, but also before the by-elections, because I think it really gives some certainty to the weight of the by-elections occurring and what that means for the Liberals. And mostly, it means that the Liberals retain or regain control of committees, which means it's easier for them to set the agenda. It's easier for them to get through some of the policies that they believe important, things that they want to see done, things that reflect some of the major investments that we've seen Mark Carney announce over the last couple of weeks. And I think that is a contrast to perhaps the fall sitting, where we didn't see a ton get through the House. And I think that this reflects sort of a new moment for spring and a new moment for the Liberals to actually achieve outcomes over the next little while.
Have we reached peak floor crossing? How likely is Marilyn Gladu to be the last?
I would say, from my perspective, MP Gladu's crossing demonstrates to me that there is a dissent and perhaps toxicity in the CPC caucus that we're not hearing about, right? I think earlier this week, we also saw Katie Merrifield, the OLO communications director, leave. And so I'm sensing that there is some, unrest in that caucus, not only because they, a year ago were told that they were going to be government and now they're not. They're seeing Mark Carney achieve things and do things that they might be interested in that reflects not only Liberal values, but really reflects Canadian values and the way that Canada's going to show up in the world. And so I think that could be more, right? And I think the one thing that we're certain of is that the next person to cross over doesn't give this government a majority. So it makes it a little bit easier. If you're a backbench Conservative member right now and you're not thinking about running again in the next election, why wouldn't you take the opportunity to be on government benches?
Two of the 5 floor crossers are to speak at your convention this weekend in a panel format, including Matt Genereux. What are you expecting to hear from the former Conservative MP from right here in Alberta?
I think one of the things that I think Matt really brings to the conversation is that Alberta perspective that's a bit different than what the Conservatives are bringing, right? And I think that that's important given the context of where Alberta is right now, having both conversations on one side of the hand with respect to the MOU and these nation-building projects, but then on the other side, talking about separation, which I know is your segment later, and how that could play out in a referendum. And I think that it's important for MPs from Alberta, Liberal MPs, to reflect, what we're fighting for federation, talking about that nation-building project that is Canada. And I think that that's kind of the perspective that Matt can really bring to the table, while also bringing sort of that lens of what does energy policy mean not just in the context of Canada, but specifically what does it mean in the context of the prairies in Alberta.
Such conventions are usually focused around discussions on policy. So where do you see those discussions going this weekend, especially with those by-elections impending?
No, I think that the Liberals are actually really famously known for having a lot of the policy that's talked about in constituency associations move to convention and then actually move to government policy, which is what we've seen in the past. I think a lot of the policy discussions this weekend reflect some of our growing concerns that Canadians are having. There's a lot to do around affordability. Which we know that we're hearing on the ground. I'm sure MPs are hearing about it at the doors. And then there's also conversations about emerging technology and AI. And I think that that's important to come from the grassroots because these are the folks that are most closest to it, whether it means, social media harms for kids or AI harms for kids. What does that mean? And you'll see a lot of that conversation happen this week at the convention floor.
You're in Quebec, where in the past separation has been a big talking point, maybe to a degree still. But how much do you expect Liberal Party members will be talking about the prospect of a referendum on separation in Alberta?
I think that when you look at the question between Alberta and Quebec, at the end of the day, nothing really is similar except for the fact that both provinces might be talking about separation. But the nature of the question, the historical roots, the question itself are so radically different. And so they're really two different and distinct conversations. One of the things that I think Danielle Smith has done either on purpose or unknowingly is really muddy the waters on the referendum when it comes to the Clarity Act. We've got 9 questions on the referendum outside of a possible question on separation. And so it's unlikely that any question would even meet the benchmark. So I guess the question for federal Liberals right now is it worth talking about that question and that, the referendum itself? Or is it more worth talking about like some of those bigger policies that Alberta wants to see incorporated, things like, the rest of the deadlines on the MOU, talking about nation building, talking about moving some of those projects to the major projects office? I think that's more productive. And I don't think necessarily delving on the question or delving on the referendum is going to be helpful.
All right. We'll have to leave it there for time. As always, appreciate your time, Sabrina. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Sabrina Grover is a Liberal strategist and a former candidate in Calgary Centre. From building opposition to the push for a separation referendum to polling on the performance of the provincial government and the changing dynamics of the federal Liberals as they head into their annual convention. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, former MLA Karen McPherson, and John Brennan is a political analyst and commentator. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with the continuation of court proceedings over the judicial review of an Alberta separation referendum, one where First Nations groups feel the separation petition disregards their treaty rights.
We see decisions that are made without us, about us, on lands that were never given up.
I think the showing here today is, like I said, a reminder that those agreements are sacred covenants to First Nations.
It's a very difficult situation. I wish the Chiefs could simply internalize the opportunity that this presents them to actually sit down at a negotiating table with Canada and Alberta in the context of negotiating independence.
Opponents of separation rallied in downtown Edmonton Wednesday, calling on the Alberta government to stop the citizen-initiated petition on independence. Several First Nations currently asking the courts for an injunction to stop the process. Karen, how consequential do you see these ongoing court proceedings being to the building debate over separation? How much of a turning point might this end up being?
Well, it really depends on the outcome. And the question is really interesting, too, because as I understand it, they're asking the court to essentially repeal the amendment that made this particular referendum possible because it didn't take First Nations or treaty agreements into consideration. So it's a very interesting question. And overall, I think the conversation about how First Nations fit into a conversation about separation and independence, I think Mr. Rath really showed his cards there. I wish they would understand. it really sounds like he hasn't made any kind of overture to have a conversation with First Nations. This has been done in isolation and really as a, kind of an egotistical sort of endeavor, rather than, oh, this is really what's good for the whole province, for everyone in the province.
John, how likely is this to influence whether or not the Smith government gives a go-ahead to an actual vote on separation when the multi-question referendum is held October 19th?
That's really hard to say, Michael, because, they created this mess with the Citizen Initiative Act. And then last November, when McAmery brought in the amendments to the Citizen Initiative Act that made it easier for the separatists to put their referendum question forward, and also made the amendment that Karen was just talking about that said any question does not have to be constitutional. Because, of course, the Court of King's Bench Justice Colin Feasby ruled literally the day that McAmery tabled the amendments to the Citizens Initiative Act that the separatist question was unconstitutional. So, Daniel Smith and the UCP government have created this mess. What's going to happen if, in fact, the Court of King's Bench Justice who's hearing this application grants an injunction? I suspect what will happen is there'll have to be a hearing down the road in front of another Court of King's Bench Justice for everybody to air their arguments. But then, Mitch Sylvester has said, well, if we lose in court and they get an injunction, we'll go to Danielle Smith and see if she'll let us put the question on the ballot. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen, Michael, but it is a complete mess, and it was created by Danielle Smith and the UCP.
Karen, a weekday rally in downtown Edmonton. How much further do you see tensions building now between the two distinct sides in the separation debate, and where does that leave the Premier at the moment?
Well, it's interesting that it wasn't just the First Nations that participated. For the Forever Canadian initiative, with their own petition that met the previous criteria for the number of signatures, has also been in court and supporting in terms of demonstrating. I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more polarization between Albertans. We're even seeing it, with people outside of the country getting involved in the conversation. On Twitter, there was a thread with Elon Musk. The more people the more attention that it draws, the more diverse the perspectives, and the less there is focusing on what do we have in common, like what is working in Alberta, then I think we're going to see more division, and it's going to drive neighbors and families and friends apart, which is very, very sad, and economically very unbeneficial for the province.
John, on that point of polarization, to what degree does current polling of public opinion play into this now?
Well, we just had a new poll out yesterday, Michael, from Pollara, which showed that 73% of Albertans would vote to stay in Canada and only 27% would vote for independence. But the key thing in this vote, Michael, which is why Danielle Smith has been pandering to the separatists all along, is that when you go into the granular detail of that poll, it shows that only 45% of UCP voters would vote to stay in Canada, whereas 55% of UCP voters would vote for independence. So this is the pickle that Danielle Smith has put herself in by pandering to the separatists, because half of her supporters support the idea of a referendum for separation. So, as I said in the previous segment, Michael, it's a real mess, and it's a mess that has been created by Danielle Smith and the UCP just because they want to hold on to power. So they feel they have to pander to the separatists in order to keep them in the UCP tent.
Okay, speaking of surveying public opinion, new polling from the Angus Reid Institute showing the Alberta government is performing better than other provinces, but half of respondents say it's on the wrong path, especially where certain issues are concerned.
So healthcare is the top issue by far. 62% of Albertans say that's the top issue. Among Albertans, only 29% believe that Danielle Smith and the UCP government is doing a good job on healthcare. So there is a lot of criticism of how the UCP have handled that file.
Now, along with the issue of healthcare, the polling shows 66% say the Smith government is doing a poor job on the cost of living. The survey also finding 46% of Albertans have a favorable view of Premier Smith compared to 33% for NDP leader Naheed Nenshi. John, how do you weigh these results? How much of an endorsement does this reflect for the Smith government?
Well, it's absolutely astounding to me, Michael, that Danielle Smith can maintain 46% approval in Alberta when you consider that the job that the UCP government is doing. As the poll showed, only 29% of Albertans were happy with the way she's managing healthcare, and only 28% of Albertans are happy with the way she's managing the cost of living issue, the two biggest issues that were raised in this poll. But it just goes to show you, Michael, and we've talked about this many times before in this program, the strength of the Conservative brand in this province. You remember in the federal election just a year ago, 68% of Albertans voted Conservative. In the last provincial election, 53% of Albertans voted Conservative. The Conservative brand is very strong, and also half the electorate in this province just have a deep antipathy towards the NDP, and this shows up in these polling results.
Karen, where do you see poll results like this leaving the Naheed Nenshi NDP? What do the results reflect about the performance of the opposition?
I think it shows that the NDP has failed to really inspire voters. They're very persistent in their criticisms of the government, and I'm not saying that it isn't justified, but what they haven't really done is illustrate for voters why they think an NDP government would be better, how Alberta would be better with NDP in control of the government. And the UCP is actually doing a really good job in messaging. They've been sending out very overall positive messaging. They've really scaled back on the negative Ottawa perspective, and they're talking more about what they've accomplished, which really seems like it's something that's setting them up for the next provincial election.
All right, time for us to take a bit of a break, but when we come back, the interesting discussions facing federal Liberals at their annual convention. More from our politics panel in a moment. Welcome back. Federal Liberals have begun gathering in Montreal for their annual convention this weekend, and it comes on the heels of Marilyn Gladu crossing the floor to the government, an Ontario MP known for socially conservative views. Here's how the Prime Minister responded to questions from reporters this morning about the Liberals becoming a big tent party.
There is a general sense of many, not everybody, but there's a general sense of many in this country, how crucial this time is and how important it is to work together to build this country. Now, if they're going to build the country, if part of that is to be part of the government caucus, yes, you support the values of the Liberal Party.
Marilyn Gladu is the 5th MP to cross to the Liberals, following the footsteps of 4 other Conservatives, including Alberta MP Matt Genereux. That brings the Liberals to within a seat of a majority. Karen, what do you feel the embrace of Marilyn Gladu says about the Liberals expanding their tent? What kind of fit is this?
I think it's an awkward fit. It's not one that I think many people would have predicted, especially based on Gladu's, very conservative social values. She's been quite outspoken about her perspective on social issues. And this is really in stark contrast to what we saw from the last Liberal government under Mr. Trudeau, where there was a big focus on more liberal social values. So I think now that that focus is gone, now that the Liberal government is focusing on building what will make Canada a stronger country, there is more room at the table for people with diverse opinions on different issues. So I think that's where it came from, but I don't think anyone could have predicted this.
Okay, so John, more room at the table, but how much do you see the Liberals shifting their values to welcome someone who has been a prominent social conservative?
I don't think that's going to happen at all, Michael. I think it's going to be the other way around. She's going to have to fit in with the Liberal Party, the Liberal caucus, and Liberal values. But, as you said in your question to Karen, the Liberal Party has now become this very big tent where it has now a very conservative, socially conservative former Conservative MP. And, just a couple of weeks ago, Laurie Idlew, the former NDP MP for Nunavut, crossed the floor to join the caucus. And we have in the upcoming by-elections next week, Michael, Dolly Begum, who was an NDP MPP in Ontario, who's running as the Liberal candidate in Scarborough Southwest in the by-election next week. So, the big tent has become very big in the Liberal caucus and the Liberal Party. But I don't see the Liberals moving to the right to accommodate Marilyn Gladue. I think it'll be the other way around, Michael.
Karen, where does this leave the Conservative tent? How much do you see this shaking up those ranks?
The tent is turning into a gazebo. There's some pieces missing from the tent walls. They're having a really hard time hanging on to their MPs, with the leader of the opposition, his comms manager or director leaving. A lot of folks are leaving, and that doesn't bode well for the future of Pierre Poilievre, regardless of his recent 80% approval at their leadership review earlier this year. It really is going to take something dramatic for the CPC to refresh and renew their support within their caucus. And, that support is going to be reflected in what voters do. It's also, this slow drip of people leaving the caucus really leaves him very vulnerable to some other mechanism to remove him from power.
John, what are the ramifications for Pierre Poilievre at this stage?
This is a really bad time for Pierre Poilievre, Michael, even though he got, as Karen said, the 87% approval at his leadership review in Calgary in late January. The wheels have just been falling off the bus since then. And now we have, in total, since November, 4 Conservative MPs having crossed the floor to join the government. We have, as Karen said, Katie Merrifield, his Director of Communications, resigning this week, with tomorrow being her last day. And, we consistently see in the polling a large lead for the Conservatives, for the Liberals over the Conservatives, I should say. And the Nanos tracker out this week, Michael, with the Liberals at 46% and the Conservatives at 31%. That means the Conservatives, Michael, are literally 10 points below the result they got in the election in April 2025. That's a big drop. And most importantly, Michael, the Nanos tracker always asks the preferred PM question. 54% of Canadians think that Mark Carney makes the best prime minister. Only 23% think that of Pierre Poilievre. That's a 31% difference, Michael. And that's what's driving the polling. And that's what's driving these MPs out of the Conservative caucus.
Karen, last 20 seconds to you. Any more floor crossings?
Well, who knows, but it's cheaper than a general election. I mean, it remains to be seen, is Poilievre able to placate those MPs that are remaining that are questionable? And I'm sure the Liberals, after the by-elections, they're not going to have as much pressure that they're going to put on targeted MPs from the CPC, but it remains to be seen.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Michael.
Now, here are a few responses to a recent story posted by CTV News, and it is about longtime Conservative Marilyn Gladue's floor crossing, leaving the Liberals one seat shy now of a majority government. Hakon says, just because floor crossings are allowed under our system doesn't make it right. Floor crossing MPs should face a by-election. Métis writes, I love it, keep them coming. Sal thinks this could be Carney's Trojan horse. When it comes time to vote, the Conservatives could vote against him. Liz says, I would be irate if my MP crossed the floor. A by-election needs to be held. And Blue writes, if individual members of a party become disillusioned by the party and no longer feel represented by its leadership, they should sit as an independent until the next election. Have your say. Email us anytime at comments@albertaprimetime.com. Coming up tomorrow with the crew of Artemis 2 on the way home from their historic lunar mission, we'll hear from an Albertan writing a book about Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. That's on Friday. Until then, have a great evening, everyone, from all of us at Alberta Primetime. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time.